Well, good morning and good Monday morning to all of you, and thank you for coming this morning as we continue our series on studying the ancient civilization of Greece. There are only 2 more days of opportunities for you to be here and elsewhere. Check your program. There are several more, and in fact, there is one more presentation immediately following this session, and that is a reschedule from last week or so. But we have a great program featuring Dr. Young here, and we're anxiously awaiting that, but I'm going to ask Dr. Wabi to introduce him.
Thank you all for coming to this session in the last week of our futuristic look through ancient lenses. This year we are looking at or through ancient Greece. Last year we looked at or through ancient Egypt, and already people are asking me about what next year. So we are contemplating, is it Rome, is it Babylonian, is it what? I don't know yet, but I think I'll keep it secret until but today we are for a treat. Our speaker, Dr. Hadrian. Oh, sorry, not Hadrian. You confused me. Very young. Very young. He is young and growing younger by the day. 15 years ago when I came here for my first year at Eastern, I thought it would be 1 year and I'd leave. And I didn't. It seems I stuck here, and they loved me. I loved them, and it's a wonderful place to be. Mary was one of the first people I met on campus, and his welcoming spirit was so important to me at that time when I didn't know almost nobody, but he was one of the first that I met. We had some common things regarding digging and playing in the sand and the clay and finding old things and ancient things. And he expressed that to me, knowing that I come from Egypt. And we talked about that time going to dig in Egypt. But I think it didn't happen yet. Well, to introduce him really well, I couldn't find a better person other than his chair. And his chair is comfortable. So please, Anita, come and introduce them.
Thank you. Well, it's my pleasure to introduce my good friend and colleague, Bailey Young. I can say that in the history department, which is known around campus for its quality in both teaching and scholarship, so I think of the faculty as scholar teachers, Dr. Young is truly distinguished and has been acknowledged as such by last year's naming of him, selection of him as EIU's distinguished faculty for the year. And so, you know, everything that has accumulated over his lifetime and career to earn him that, I can't possibly cover it today, but I give you our distinguished faculty person.
Not yet extinguished.
Yeah.
Right. I had some, I'm going to apologize because, let's see, I had problems with getting my computer infected when I was doing the PowerPoint on Saturday. And, whoa, where'd we go there? That's not where we want to be. That's where we want to be.
I'll take your microphone because you have two now. So this one would work.
This one works fine. I don't need to hold the microphone.
Very good.
Anyway, so I wasn't able to complete the PowerPoint, and they just managed to clean my computer this morning, and I was able to add a couple of slides very quickly. Oh, I'll fumble around a bit, perhaps. So we have here, perhaps we should put the lights down a bit. You can see better. The ever victorious, it is August of AD 117, and it's a very hot day. We're in what's now Iraq. The ever victorious Trajan, the 15th emperor of Rome, lay dying. Only the year before, he had stood triumphantly at the head of the Persian Gulf. Oops. There we go. That's what we want. Here. You all know where the Persian Gulf is. the first Roman general ever to humble the Parthian enemy by driving him from his own capital. And as he looked out over the waters to the east, he was thinking of the great Alexander, his role model, the king of the Macedonians and the strategos of all the Greeks who 4 centuries earlier had destroyed Persia's empire in these same lands and pushed on east towards the end of the world as far as the fabulous India. If only he could follow. In 15 years, Trajan had emulated Alexander by his policy of expanding frontiers by bold military aggression. The rich and powerful Dacian kingdom north of the Danube had fallen before his attacks, winning him triumphal honors whose stone and bronze monuments we may still admire today in Rome and elsewhere. And now Persia's heir, Parthia, which had so often in the past threatened Rome's interests in the Greek-speaking eastern provinces, Parthia had even defeated Roman armies and ultimate shame carried off Roman standards and eagles. Now Parthia's own core provinces of Mesopotamia were about to become Rome's eastern frontier. For 15 years, Trajan, the outsider who had thrust his way into the elite circles of Italy from a colonial family in distant Spain, the first non-Italian ever to be raised to the purple, Trajan had revived the old tradition of military glory and pushed Rome's frontiers farther than ever before or ever again. In May 116, in mighty Babylon, where Alexander had died, Trajan offered sacrifice to the shade of the world conqueror, officially a god. Word came of a Senate decree bestowing on him the title Parthicus in advance of the triumph that would await his return. The historian is entitled to wonder, however, did the victorious general realize even then, at that moment of boasting his glory in dispatches to the Senate, did he realize how fragile was his achievement as he felt his own growing weakness and began to withdraw westwards? Did the sound administrator not understand how thinly stretched were his troops, how vulnerable to counterattack his overextended resources? For bad news was reaching the emperor. A serious revolt had broken out among the Jews in Palestine. The recently subdued barbarians in Dacia, abetted by the dangerous Scythians, had thrown the new Danubian province into turmoil. Trajan ordered one of his most trusted lieutenants, the governor of Syria, the core province of the Roman East, to deal with Dacia and to replace him in the key post in Antioch. He named the young cousin with whom he had over the years an off-and-on relationship, Publius alias Hadrianus, our Hadrian. This move was a clue that cheered Hadrian's friends and alarmed his foes, a clue that at long last the childless emperor would follow old Roman precedents and adopt his cousin as his heir, unless he died first. The events of early August 117 offer conspiracy fans then and now matter for a field day. Trajan seems to have thought he was being slowly poisoned. At least that rumor was recorded later by Dio Cassius, the great Greek historian who was also a senator. The imperial party got as far as the city of Selinus in Cappadocia. The essential caregivers to the ailing emperor were the noble empress Plotina and Trajan's niece Matidia. Both women were firm supporters of Hadrian, who was married to Matidia's daughter Sabina. On August 9th, messengers arrived in Antioch bearing official letters confirming to Hadrian that Trajan had formally adopted him. He was now Caesar, the title of the presumptive emperor while awaiting endorsement from the Senate. Trajan was probably already dead at that moment, for on August 11th, Official news of the deceased reached the Syrian capital, and the legions at once acclaimed their commander, Imperator. Hadrian moved quickly and decisively. Within days, perhaps hours, of this notice, he issued orders that the new provinces east of the Euphrates, Macedonia, Cappadocia, well, not all of Cappadocia, Armenia anyway, Greater Armenia, were to be evacuated. He set off to meet the imperial ladies with Trajan's ashes, put them on a ship to Rome, no doubt with a private message for the all-powerful Praetorian prefect Antinous, on whom he knew he could count. Hadrian knew, too, that he had very dangerous enemies, high-ranking senators and key players in the aggressive policies of Trajan, men we would call hawks today, who would be outraged by the changes he was planning. We would call Hadrian a dove. They would stop at nothing to stop him. One of them commanded the forces putting down the Jewish revolt, Lucius Quietus, a Moorish prince as well as a Roman general. He had his own guard of devoted tribesmen. Quietus was quickly stripped of his command and of his guard and ordered back to Italy. Moving through Asia Minor to see for himself what had to be done to save the situation in Dacia, Trajan met with Avidius Nigrinus, among the noblest of Romans and most trusted of Hadrian's commanders. The story told in a later source has it that Hadrian narrowly escaped death in an ambush Nigrinus set for him during an animal hunt. Whatever really happened, Hadrian's enemies will say it was all a frame-up. Nigrinus was sent home to Italy, where he and Lucius Quietus and two other high-ranking ex-consular figures were soon condemned for treason by the Senate and executed. It is clear that the Senate acted only under extreme pressure from the Praetorian prefect Antinous, the man with all the military muscle in Rome. Hadrian was still far away, taking decisive measures in Dacia. Here, too, he abandoned some, though not all, of Trajan's conquests, made peace with the most dangerous Scythian king, changing this enemy into a Roman citizen and ally. When he finally reached Rome on the 9th of July, 118, almost a year after Trajan's death, he sought to soothe the senators outraged by the executions. Antinous had overreached, he said in a speech that amounts to an apology. Antinous is dismissed. Nothing like this will ever happen again. Were they mollified, these famously conservative old Romans, by this young provincial upstart? Hadrian was 42, who many of them had dismissed for years as that little Greekling, Graculus. Look at him. He wears a beard. Perhaps they weren't. But for all his polite deference to the Senate, it was clear where the power lay. The point was soon made by a new coin that depicted the old emperor, now officially a god, clean-shaven in the good old Roman tradition, shaking hands with his adopted heir and successor, the bearded Greekling. Hadrian firmly denied that he intended to make important changes. Unlike modern Americans, the ancient Romans hated the idea of change. But the beard was the fashion clue that he did indeed have a new agenda for the empire, albeit one grounded in a very old, complex, and ambiguous relationship, Romans and Greeks, Greeks and Romans. Let's take a closer look at the background of that relationship. Cats and dogs, cowboys and Indians, artists and engineers, liberals and conservatives, professors and business execs. Do we dare suggest on this day in the month of November, Democrats and Republicans? How strongly are we drawn to these clearly etched antinomies? In Hadrian's day, Greeks and Romans was a cultural polarity whose common stereotypes everyone instantly recognized. Cato the Elder, a prominent Roman politician back in the days of the Republic, there he is, With a reputation for crusty mind speaking, the vehement defender of conservative values of the forefathers, Cato broadcast this highly negative stereotype. Concerning those Greeks, Marcus, my son, let me tell you what I learned by my own experience in Athens. It's okay to glance at their famous culture, but don't go overboard and get hooked. Take my word for it, the Greeks are a most iniquitous, untrustworthy, tricky bunch. The day we buy into all their stuff is the day we decline into degenerates like them. This will happen all the sooner if we let their doctors have a go at us. Those doctors, it's all a conspiracy to murder foreigners with their so-called medicine. They win our confidence, take our money, and kill us to boot. Cato wrote in the days when Romans, having defeated their dangerous Carthaginian enemy, were in the Punic Wars, were rapidly expanding into a world empire and starting to rule over the Greeks. When they captured the rich Greek city of Syracuse, there on Sicily in 202 BC, a Roman soldier came upon Archimedes, the great scientist and engineer, drawing some figures in the sand with a stick, figuring that he must be up to some tricky mumbo-jumbo. He killed him on the spot. A few years later, however, a federation of Greek city-states fighting for independence from their powerful northern neighbor Macedon. Remember Alexander? Alexander's history now, but Macedon is still trying to rule Greece. These Greeks called on the Romans for help. Having their own bone to pick with Macedon, which had aided their enemy Carthage, the Romans were happy to oblige, and bingo, Macedon is soon the first Roman colony in the eastern Mediterranean, otherwise known as the Hellenistic world. Are the Greeks grateful? Those tricky bastards. Just because the Romans are now demanding tribute payments for their help, and Italian merchants are all over the place muscling into the business of the Greeks, these treacherous bastards riot and even murder Romans. We'll teach them a lesson. So in 143 BC, a Roman army spends 3 days sacking Corinth, the richest city in Greece, with every soldier entitled to his share of treasures, including the people who weren't killed, many shipped to Italy as slaves. A couple of generations later, it is the turn of Athens to face the sharp point of the famous Roman sword. By this time, the Romans had taken over all of the eastern Mediterranean. The Hellenistic king Mithridates in Asia Minor was making a last-ditch defense, and the Roman general Sulla was on his way to deal with him, pausing before the ancient famous city of Socrates and Plato, accused of complicity. The Athenians sent out their best orators to plead, hoping that Sulla will spare the city which had once stood up to mighty Persia in defense of freedom. The Roman general sneers, "I'm not here to take a history lesson. I'm here to teach treacherous rebels a lesson. Rome rules." That's the Roman hardline. But at the very same time that Cato was brandishing the negative stereotype, another leading Roman noble, Scipio Aemilianus, was promoting a very different view. Scipio was not naive about power. His grandfather was the one who had beaten Hannibal and won the first major Roman overseas colonies, including the one in Spain where Hadrian's ancestors settled. Scipio realized it would take a lot more than military power and pride in the old-fashioned bootstrap virtues of the ancestors to rule a complex multinational world. And he realized it was the Greeks who had developed the political, intellectual, and cultural skills for the job. By no means all the Greeks in Rome came there as slaves. Besides the doctors that Cato mentions, there were teachers of all kinds flocking there to sell their expertise, and elite pro-Roman families would send their sons to develop positive relationships with the new leaders. Today we call this networking. Scipio developed a friendship with one of the brightest of these, Polybius, who turned his access into the highest Roman circles into a book that has remained a fundamental classic of political science from that day to this. Polybius analyzed the Roman system of government both to understand how this little Italian city-state had come so far so fast, and to predict what would happen next. He correctly identified the strengths of its system of checks and balances, and in the Roman loyalty to the state in the face of attack, and he predicted correctly in the long run that Rome would go on to conquer and unite the entire Mediterranean world. Polybius did not foresee, it is true, that the unbridled greed and unscrupulous determination of a handful of elite families, the Roman 1% or half 1%, to keep all the wealth and power in their hands would lead to bloody civil war. But these same elite families hired Greek teachers and Greek architects and artists, consulted Greek doctors, ignoring Cato, and astrologers, imported Greek wines and other luxury products like silk, spices, fine glassware brought from the East by merchants speaking Greek, even when they themselves were Egyptian or Syrian or Arab or whatever. Ever since Alexander's conquest, Greek had become so much the universal language of culture and business that the very first Roman to try his hand at writing Roman history wrote it in Greek. Let us quote here one of the leading scholars of Greek and Roman culture in the world today, Professor Greg Wolfe of St. Andrews University in Scotland, the editor of this book, which I heartily recommend to you. There was no Rome before Greece. Objects of Greek manufacture have been found in the earliest levels of the city of Rome to be explored archaeologically. It could fairly be said that the world into which the Romans first appeared, through which they spread and over which they finally achieved dominion, was always a Greek world. Yet the relationship between the Romans and the Greeks did change over time until each identity had been remodeled largely in relation to the other. The better to appreciate Hadrian's key role in this remodeling, we need to take a closer look at how the stereotypes played out in the tensions of the crucial moment of Rome's political and cultural reinvention, the transition from the Republic to the Empire. In contrast to the brutal Sulla, whose idea of restoring order when he got control of Rome was to post a hit list of enemies, the statesman Marcus Tullius Cicero was determined to build the basis of civil society by translating the highest Greek ideals into Latin. Though ready to use swift and ruthless force to save the state when threatened by a conspiracy, his long-term goal was to draw on Greek philosophy, notably ethics, to moralize Roman and personal and political behavior. Though he himself perished for offending one of the warlords in the late round of the Civil War, his ideas, phrased in a lucid and elegant Latin quickly recognized as the quintessence of classical, took deep root. Other authors of this time were also challenging the old intellectual monopoly of Greek by composing Latin works of such high literary quality, especially in history and poetry, that this time has ever since been regarded as a golden age. Like Cicero, these writers were both keenly aware of their debt to Greece. Many of them had been there to study as young men, and proud of their ability to craft a new literature in their own language to rival it. Julius Caesar was not only a great general and statesman, he wrote a military history of his own wars of conquest that incorporated perspectives taken from Greek ethnographers. The great poet of good living in the countryside, Horace, acknowledged Rome's debt to Greece with ironic grace in his famous phrase, Graecia capta ferum victorum sapit. Captive Greece conquered her savage victor. And I thank Lee Patterson for providing this text. We would say the Greeks conquered the hearts and minds. But surely Horace implies that the Latin poets can now take things to the next level. The greatest of these poets was Virgil, who modeled his epic poem, the Aeneid, on Homer's Odyssey, going back to the same old story of the Trojan War as the Greek bards, in order to vaunt in the purest Latin verse ever written that Rome's high destiny. The Trojan prince Aeneas, escaping massacre by the Greeks at the fall of Troy, arriving in Italy, hears a prophecy that from the family line he will one day a great leader come to bring to the world an age of gold. This, of course, was Caesar Augustus, who had now won the civil wars, was creating the Roman Empire. Augustus was a patron of Virgil. This painting imagines Virgil reading from the Aeneid to Augustus and his family. Not a Roman painting, but never mind. Augustus, here the poet is reading to his patron these lines, which aptly sum up what I shall call the balanced Roman view of the relationship of Greece to Rome as BC switches to AD. Here are the lines. Others will cast more tenderly in bronze their breathing figures, I can well believe, and bring more lifelike portraits out of marble. Argue more eloquently, use the pointer to trace the paths of heaven accurately and accurately foretell the rising stars. Okay, the Greeks, they're great artists and scientists. Roman, remember your strength to rule earth's peoples. For your arts are to be these, to pacify, to impose the rule of law, to spare the conquered, and to crush the proud. Wonderful words, high ideals. Augustus sought to embody this vision in a policy called Pax Romana. Shielded from danger by Rome's mighty legions, the civilized world would enjoy the fruits of peace, the golden age predicted by the Aeneid, proclaimed by Horace. Only in reality, a bit over a century later, when Hadrian assumed power, was this working out? As Hadrian knew, there had been some pretty close shaves since Augustus. Rebellions, conspiracies, mutinies, senators accused of treason and executed, emperors paranoid, crazy, despotic, and or depraved. Look at Nero. See if we can find Nero here. There he is. Wasn't enough that he fiddled, playing the lyre, actually, while Rome burned, acting like a Greek. He thought himself an artist. He actually went to Greece for the Olympic Games, the first emperor ever to go there, qua emperor. It wasn't even the Olympic year. But so what? I'm here, so it's the year. And I'm so Greek, I'm a tip-top athlete. Watch me compete. I can't be beat. So he won all the first prizes. To sober Romans, this was like Cato's worst nightmare coming true. So degenerate. Old-fashioned Roman virtue corrupted by Greek wiles. The Senate is cowed and gutless. The senators with guts got them spilled. So the legions take things into their own hands, but they don't all agree. Nero kills himself, and now the generals are fighting for the purple. 4 emperors in 1 year alone, AD 69. Fortunately, the winner, Vespasian, is competent and has the right values, restores military discipline. Down to earth, sense of humor too. Thinks up a special tax on peeing in the public toilet. You pay it with this, a bronze penny. His son and heir objects, Dad, people won't like this tax. Vespasian thrusts the penny under his nose. Does it stink? Vespasian and Trajan, clean-shaven generals, have a policy we might call back to Roman basics. Conquering and ruling, especially with lots of crushing the proud, that's what real Romans do. That's our mission. Trajan particularly, as we have seen, wholly embraced the vision. Expand the borders, whack the Dacians and Parthians, grow the empire, grow, grow, grow. But hey, whatever happened to the Pax Romana? Now we're back in the summer of AD 117. We can picture the hawks like Lucius Quietus with his personal guard of Moorish tribesmen, sneering. Rome is about projecting power. Peace is for bearded wimps. Now we're in the summer of 118. Lucius and his chums have apparently played their cards, lost, paid the price. But that price has outraged many in the Senate who think pretty much like them. Hadrian has made it to Rome alive. The Senate has done what has to be done, confirming him in the imperial power, but many people aren't happy about it. So what happens next? What happens next is Hadrian changes the course of the Roman ship of state and pleases his own personal taste as well. Now, Hadrian reigned 20 years, 118 to 138 AD. Historians always emphasize two aspects of those years: his astonishing record of travel. There's the clean-shaven guys. Let's just go on here. Okay, we see the whole empire. His resolute promotion of Greek cultural values and of talented Greeks as well. In the time we have left, I will attempt to show you that these were both features of a bold and creative political vision, and I shall introduce you briefly to the person who aroused my interest in Hadrian, not a professional historian, but an historical novelist. Well, let's start with a little family background. Like his cousin Trajan, Hadrian was born in AD 76 during the reign of Vespasian in a little town in southern Spain, probably. Maybe he was actually born in Rome. His father's hometown, Italica, was a colony for Italian veterans of the Punic Wars. His mother came from the much older city of Gades, Cadiz today, which goes back to even pre-Carthaginian times, much older than Rome itself. But it would be a mistake to see Hadrian as a rustic Spaniard come to Rome to escape his roots and make good, like a West Texas politician, say Lyndon Johnson, striving to make it in D.C. or New York City. Given his father's mobile and upwardly mobile career, he may have only visited Italica once or twice briefly in his life as a kid. His whole life he was a cosmopolitan world traveler. It's likely indeed that in his early childhood he spent time in one of the quintessential centers of Greek culture, Ephesus, because his father had a top job there. And early influences, as we know, can be very decisive. By the time he comes into focus for us in the sources, he's a young Roman who's put on the toga virilis, living with relatives in Rome. His parents have now died, studying and preparing for the first steps into an official career, the cursus honorum. It's important to stress that from the beginning, the path was military rather than civil. In the 90s, he served as military tribune successively in 3 legions on the active and dangerous Danubian frontier and the Rhine. Though a staff officer, in theory second in command, he was expected to learn the ropes from the experienced centurions and those battle-hardened soldiers. He developed the ability to mix easily with common soldiers, often sharing their hardships and their rations. Even hostile sources grant that he was most skilled with weapons and most adept at military science. War and security on the frontiers, experienced along with the grunts and the non-coms, this was the first area of expertise on his CV. Dramatic regime change in Rome gave him unprecedented career boost. In AD 96, the Emperor Domitian, hated with good reason by the elites, was murdered and replaced by the aging senator Nerva. Would the armies accept, or, as in 69, rebel? Soon it was announced that Nerva had adopted as his heir the popular General Trajan, Hadrian's cousin, and now his commander in Germany as well. The armies were happy now, especially as Trajan paid them a big bonus and began preparing his aggressive war against Dacia. While this was happening, Hadrian was given an important administrative post in Rome, Questor, to build the civilian side of his CV. And what's more, he married in 100 the emperors. Nerva had now died, and Trajan was emperor. Niece, or great niece, Sabina. There she is on that coin. There is no doubt that the agents of this match were the bride's mother, Matidia, and Trajan's very influential wife, Plotina. These ladies were to play a crucial role, as we've seen already, in engineering Hadrian's accession. The marriage, however, proved to be loveless. We will see that the mature Hadrian found love elsewhere. Hadrian was given command of a legion in the Dacian War, winning military distinction. He became governor of a new province carved from the conquered territory, which gave him the opportunity to hand out jobs and build up his personal network. His nomination as junior consul of Rome following in 108 was a mark of distinction, but it was mostly an honor, not real work. Lavish dinner parties and nasty gossip bored him. Biographer Anthony Beerley, that's his book over there, suggests that when his term of office was up, the 30-something seized the moment to go visit Greece, perhaps invited by another of the junior consuls, one of the richest men in the Hellenistic world, who had a big house in Athens. His nickname was King Philopappus because his ancestors had been kings in Greek Asia before the Romans took over. What is certain is that he and Hadrian developed a long-term friendship, and that by 112 the young Roman had developed a lifelong love for Athens and the cultural ideals it embodied. Let's try to imagine him now, mounting the Acropolis to visit the Parthenon, as yet undamaged. Only about 500 years old then. We know that he made many good friends in elite Athenian society, for he was offered and he accepted Athenian citizenship, and in 112 AD was appointed archon, city magistrate, a title harking back to the glorious days of the past. Anthony Beerley thinks that at this time Hadrian went to visit Epictetus, one of the greatest of the Stoic philosophers who lived in a nearby city. The time was ripe at last for a meeting of the minds between the Roman man of action and the Greek intellectuals. From this time on, his contacts with them will only develop and deepen. Perhaps he had already acquired his Greek private secretary, Phlegonon, who will serve him all his life and pass on stories after his death. Hadrian the Philhellene, his reputation is now set. Well, we've seen how swiftly the new ruler moved to get Roman troops out of Mesopotamia. Why did I almost say Iraq? And soon he was dealing with the mess Trajan's glory hunting had left behind in Dacia. Why am I tempted to say Afghanistan? Through a shrewd combination of military strength and diplomacy, these early episodes establish the pattern of his reign, suggest that he already had the outlines of an overall vision for the whole of the Roman world. Let me suggest a shorthand slogan for this policy: enough growth, let's make it safer and better. It's hard for us to understand today how much political courage and resolve it took in AD 120 to change the emphasis from war, glorious war, to Pax Romana. How well the young emperor understood the dangers is shown by his decisive early measures, his putting to death the 4 officials, and his emphasizing continuity with Trajan, now a god. There's a fine balance of threat and promise in the message for many senators who shared the hostility of the dead 4 towards the Greekling. Don't cross the line and we'll get along fine. But then he set off on a tour of the empire, traveling more extensively and systematically than any emperor before or after him. Anthony Beerley points out that he spent a good half of his 21-year reign outside of Italy. His presence is attested in almost all of the 30-odd provinces of the empire. By contrast, his successor never once left Italy in a reign of the same length. So what was he doing on all these travels? His bold new policy was to consolidate the long frontiers of the empire, to make it safer, and we'll illustrate this with just one example. The 80 went all the way up to the northern part of England. The northern parts of the Isle called Britannia had never settled down in the 70 years since the Romans had come. There were often rebellions, often provoked by the brutal and greedy actions of local Roman officials, and raids south by the tough, tattooed, blue-painted warriors called Picti. Hadrian went himself to this remote region, made the decision that a realistic solution would be a stout wall across the narrowest part from the Tyne to the Solway. And work began at once. Excavations at Housesteads, one of the forts, have turned up actual documents from this period, giving precise details on such matters as food rations and discipline, a theme also stressed on Hadrian's coinage. Well, we won't follow him in the rest of his travels because we need to get him back to the east and finish things up. Hadrian was in no sense an anti-military figure, uncomfortable with or suspicious of military men. Indeed, as we've seen, the entire success of his vision of an empire refocused from habitual aggression to an emphasis on Pax Romana depended on his strengths as a military commander, profoundly in touch with the soldiers, especially the career men, the grunts and the hard-bitten centurions, who were the guarantee of discipline. In this, he was the worthy successor of the popular general emperors Trajan, Vespasian, who had saved what was worth saving. But in Hadrian's vision of empire, it was worth saving because it preserved and enhanced what we call today civil society. And at the heart of that was the rich cultural heritage crafted over the centuries by the Greeks. So we'll conclude today with a glimpse of the emperor in relation to Athens, to ancient Egypt, the seedbeds of culture, and finally in Rome. For most of the 120s, Hadrian was in the Hellenistic East. Maybe we'll go back. Let's see. Go back and give you that map. He visited the great historical places, Sparta, Corinth, now rebuilt after its long ago punishment and flourishing again. He added here an aqueduct, there baths, Olympia, where he did not order the games to be held out of sequence or insist on getting the first prizes. But his favorite place was Athens. He had been honored as its archon even before he was emperor. Early in his reign, he and Plotina had cooperated to revive and endow a famous school of philosophy. On this visit, he had himself initiated into the ancient mysteries of Eleusis, sacred to all Greeks, and under the particular care of the Athenians. Throughout his reign, Hadrian spent lavishly to revive and enhance the traditions created centuries before by Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, the Stoic and Epicurean philosophers. Pericles, the ancient leader, had proclaimed Athens the school of Hellas. Hadrian was determined to make Hellas the school, and Athens at its center, the school of the whole Greco-Roman world, which we can now talk about in those terms. His flagship project was to complete a colossal temple to Olympian Zeus that had been started 700 years earlier by the Athenian leader Pisistratus. What remains today is still impressive. And thanks to our own Professor Patterson, we have a photo, which I may have time to show you This was to serve as the center of the Panhellenion, a new cultural association that Hadrian godfathered to bring together under Athens' leadership all the Greeks scattered throughout the empire. Clearly, it was his intention that the Greeks, with all their talent for art and science, become full partners in what it is now fair to call the Greco-Roman world civilization. Hadrian also implemented this resolve by encouraging elite Greeks to embrace imperial careers and promoting them to high positions that could lead all the way to membership in the Senate itself. One example must suffice. Hadrian became friends with Arrian from a distinguished Greek family in Nicomedia, with whom he shared interests both intellectual, literature and philosophy, and sporting. Both men loved to hunt. Here. That's the philosopher Epictetus, who was the master of Arrian, and Hadrian also admired. These are pictures of Greek philosophers, mosaics from the time. Arrian served in the Roman military under Trajan. Hadrian promoted him proconsul in Spain, junior consul in Rome, and governor of the key and very dangerous province of Cappadocia. Both men were writers as well. Hadrian wrote an autobiography, unfortunately lost. We'll see a poem it hasn't at the end. But several of Arrian's writings survive. He wrote A Life of Alexander the Great, which is one of our principal sources. Hadrian actively promoted the integration of highly educated Greek aristocrats into the governing elite of the empire, to the dismay of crusty Roman traditionalists in the Senate. And from his day on, there would be more and more of these imperial Greeks. The empire as a whole benefited greatly from the diversity and high intellectual level of this expanded elite. No wonder that the great historian Edward Gibbon credits Hadrian as one of the greatest emperors of the Golden Age. Now, in his private life, too, Hadrian embraced the Greek sexual tradition, or one of them. And we come finally here to his boyfriend. In this tradition, a mature man, Erastes, enjoys a special relationship with a beautiful youth, Eromenos. Antinous was a country lad from Bithynia in his mid-teens when he caught the emperor's eye, and it's a fair guess that he traveled with the imperial entourage over the next years, no doubt, as the novelist Marguerite Yourcenar imagines, becoming initiated into the Eleusinian mysteries alongside his lover. His fame, however, comes from the mysterious and dramatic circumstances of his death. In AD 130, during an imperial tour of Egypt, the 20-year-old lad drowned in the Nile. Accident, suicide, self-sacrifice, connected with magical rites. Egypt is famous for that. Murder? From that day to this, the subject has been much discussed, and we shall never know for sure. What we do know is that Hadrian's grief was expressed on an epic and grandiose scale. The city, a new city, was to be founded on the spot where the boy died, named Antinopolis, and he was to be worshipped there as a god and elsewhere. Thus, the many fine sculptures that we have today of his adolescent good looks derive from this moment. Now, the sculptural tradition shall be our cue to follow Hadrian at last home to Rome, where, weary of travel, he pretty much settled down in his last years. There's a whole book devoted to his building in Rome. It's right here if you want to look at it, and I'm not going to talk about it. Let's just talk. I should mention the Pantheon, originally built at the time of Augustus and rebuilt with this extraordinary dome, which I think Beerley says is the the greatest freestanding dome in the world from then until the 20th century, and which has inspired many architects and artists ever since. And Pantheon is to all the gods, not just one god. It's a symbol of Hadrian's cosmopolitan devotion. But he built in Tivoli, 20 miles from Rome in the Sabine Hills, a complex more than a square kilometer with over 30 buildings, now a World Heritage Site, where he himself seems to have designed his own buildings. You see here examples of the famous Maritime Temple, where he had created a water space and built a simple house with an elegant dining room and library, symbolizing his tastes, somewhat Epicurean tastes, enjoying friendship, reading, and so forth. The Canopus Pool, which you see here, was inspired by the Serapeum, the most famous temple complex of Egypt, blending Greek with native traditions. John Julius Norwich, the architectural historian, calls this a delightful blend of sculpture, architecture, and waterworks. And not only did the much-traveled emperor incorporate architectural forms and decoration, he filled his villa with the finest works of Greek art, some of them originals from classical times, some copies made by artists of his own day. This proved to be an invaluable investment that bore fruit many centuries after Hadrian's death. One day in 1924, a young Frenchwoman about the age of Antinous when he died discovered these gardens and fell in love with the mind of the man who had conceived it, and the age which gave scope to develop it, an age, she later wrote, when men could think and express themselves in full freedom. Thus began a literary project that matured over 30 years. She studied the sources, steeped herself in classical culture until she felt she could speak with her protagonist's own voice to reimagine his lost autobiography. The Memoirs of Hadrian, published in 1954, proved that historical fiction, then regarded by most critics as a dubious and minor genre, could rise to the ranks of serious literature. Marguerite Yourcenar's achievement was fully recognized when in 1980 she became the first woman ever to be elected to the French Academy. Is it an irony that by this time she had become an American, living on an island off the coast of Maine? Hadrian, the great cosmopolitan, would have surely relished the irony, if irony it is. Let us now ourselves attempt a futuristic act of literary imagination, in imitation of Virgil, sending his hero Aeneas into the underworld to query the shades of the departed about the times to come. We come upon the shade of Hadrian. Behold our multicultural nation, we say unto him. Our America, like your Greco-Rome, at once a far-flung empire wielding fearful power and a stirring ideal of human freedom and creativity, what destiny do you see for us? What counsel for these times, more trying perhaps even than your own? Will tomorrow's election usher in another reign of gold? Unlike Margaret Yourcenar, I shall not attempt to channel the long departed Philhellene ruler. I will leave you with his last words to him. Not long before he died, Hadrian wrote a short poem, 19 words, addressed to his own soul. Animula vagula blandula, little soul, little wanderer, little charmer, body's guest and companion, to what places will you set out now? To darkling, cold, and gloomy places where you won't make your usual jokes.
Very good. We have 2 minutes to noontime and a couple of questions if you like, or comments. Any comments or questions? I have one quick one for you if I may.
Of course.
Until we get another question. can we be comfortable in saying, as you tried to tell us, that Hadrian is credited for keeping the Greek tradition alive?
I would put it even more strongly than that. Hadrian refocuses the Roman Empire on the Greek tradition, and that's one of the reasons so much Greek stuff has come down to us today. Now, some of my colleagues here might think that that's putting it too strongly. But yes, definitely.
When we say Greco-Roman and we say Judeo-Christian, is there any parallels in there or no? Two things, two streams coming together or making one thing? Or
Well, it's always a complex thing, and it's never a simple thing. There's always a lot of overlap and ambiguity. For example, in Judeo-Christian, some people have remarked Jesus was a Jew. Later, after Hadrian, the Greeks became particularly enthusiastic about Christianity, and that changed the nature of Hellenism. But that is another completely different topic. Yes, I think we have to have a sense of nuance when we use these terms. It would also be wrong to say that Hadrian was, I called him a dove at one point as opposed to a hawk. Well, that's an analogy. It's debatable, but that's why I emphasized how strong his military credentials were. He was a strong military man who also strongly believed in peace and civilization.
his contemporaries would look at him as a backward-looking guy who looked to the defeated culture. We are Romans now. We conquered them militarily. Is he a backward person? Is he a traitor to the new regime or world order?
What would you say, Lee? He's the classical historian here.
Just very, very briefly, I would say that considering his predecessor, Trajan, was named by the Senate Optimus Princeps, the best emperor, basically because of his conquests, and then Hadrian comes along. I don't know if I would say he was a dove, but I would say he had a very acute strategic sense, and so he understood that Mesopotamia and Armenia were overextending the Roman Empire, and so that's what informed his strategic decisions. Arguably Dacia too, but he retained Dacia because they had a lot of gold up there. So that did not sit well with a lot of Romans who wanted to keep going out further and further and deal with those Parthians that had been a thorn in our side for 150 years. But in general, yeah, it did sort of go against the grain to withdraw, and this was not something that was been done very much. It just once or twice before, so not much of a precedent for it. But it made very good strategic sense, and in retrospect, that was recognized. But at the time, it was problematic for many Romans.
When he died, some people in the Senate tried to get his memory condemned. They never forgave him for being the kind of guy he was, and the only reason it didn't happen was because his successor was powerful enough to make him a god instead.
So that was a political thing.
Yes,
Politics
very political.
and military.
Trajan was a very popular emperor with everybody. Hadrian was unpopular with a lot of people, although not with everybody, but a lot of what we would call establishment people. So he only survived because he was also tough, and there was a conspiracy against him when he was just a year or two before he died, and he had to put to death his own brother-in-law. Well, he had to. He did anyway.
Okay, very good. One quick question. Latin and Greek languages, how did they survive together under the...
Well, they precisely survived because Hadrian, not only because of Hadrian, as I tried to show, the tradition of appropriating Greek culture to Rome is something that goes way back. But Hadrian certainly encouraged this, so that in his time, you weren't considered educated unless you fully possessed both the Greek and the Latin heritage. And when that was lost, we come to the Middle Ages. It's no longer the ancient world. And that's another story.
Well, another story, another day, another session. Thank you very much for coming. And we have a certificate of appreciation to our distinguished speaker. He just came from Europe, huh?
Yes, that's. I was on my travels. Thank you,
so
Alan.
much. Thank you very much.
Always a pleasure.
It didn't happen yet. Well, to introduce him really well, I couldn't find a better person other than his chair. And his chair is comfortable. So please, Anita, come and introduce him.
Thank you. Well, it's my pleasure to introduce my good friend and colleague, Bailey Young. I can say that in the history department, which is known around campus for its quality in both teaching and scholarship, so I think of the faculty as scholar teachers, Dr. Young is truly distinguished and has been acknowledged as such by last year's naming of him, selection of him as EIU's distinguished faculty for the year. And so, you know, everything that has accumulated over his lifetime and career to earn him that, I can't possibly cover it today, but I give you our distinguished faculty person.
Not yet extinguished.
Yeah.
Right. I had some. I'm going to apologize because, let's see. I had problems.
Me about what next year. So we're contemplating, is it Rome? Is it Babylonian? Is it what? I don't know yet, but I think I'll keep it secret until. But today we are for a treat. Our speaker, Dr. Hadrian. Oh, sorry, not Hadrian. You confused me. Dr. Very young. Very young. He is young and growing younger by the day. 15 years ago, when I came here for my first year at Eastern, I thought it would be 1 year and I'd leave. And I didn't. It seems I stuck here, and they loved me. I loved them, and it's a wonderful place to be. Mary was one of the first people I met on campus, and his welcoming spirit was so important to me at that time when I didn't know almost nobody, but he was one of the first that I met. We had some common things regarding digging and playing in the sand and the clay and finding old things and ancient things. And he expressed that to me, knowing that I come from Egypt. And we talked about that time going to dig in Egypt. But I think at
Well, good morning and good Monday morning to all of you, and thank you for coming this morning as we continue our series on studying the ancient civilization of Greece. There are only 2 more days of opportunities for you to be here and elsewhere. Check your program. There are several more, and in fact there is one more presentation immediately following this session, and that is a reschedule from last week or so. But we have a great program featuring Dr. Young here, and we're anxiously awaiting that, but I'm going to ask Dr. Wabi to introduce him.
Thank you all for coming to this session in the last week of our futuristic look through ancient lenses. This year we are looking at or through ancient Greece. Last year we looked at or through ancient Egypt. And already people are asking.
As he looked out over the waters to the east, he was thinking of the great Alexander, his role model, the king of the Macedonians, and the strategos of all the Greeks who 4 centuries earlier had destroyed Persia's empire in these same lands and pushed on east towards the end of the world, as far as the fabulous India. If only he could follow. In 15 years, Trajan had emulated Alexander by his policy of expanding frontiers by bold military aggression. The rich and powerful Dacian kingdom north of the Danube had fallen before his attacks, winning him triumphal honors whose stone and bronze monuments we may still admire today in Rome and elsewhere. And now Persia's heir, Parthia, which had so often in the past threatened Rome's interests in the Greek-speaking eastern provinces, Parthia had even defeated Roman armies and ultimate shame carried off Roman standards and eagles. Now Parthia's own core provinces of Mesopotamia, with getting my computer infected when I was doing the PowerPoint on Saturday. And, whoa, where'd we go there? That's not where we want to be. That's where we want to be.
I'll take your microphone because you have 2 now. So this one would work.
This one works fine. I don't need to hold the microphone. Anyway, so I wasn't able to complete the PowerPoint, and they just managed to clean my computer this morning, and I was able to add a couple of slides very quickly. Oh, I'll fumble around a bit, perhaps. So we have here, perhaps we should put the lights down a bit. You can see better. The ever victorious, it is August of AD 117, and it's a very hot day. We're in what's now Iraq. The ever victorious Trajan, the 15th emperor of Rome, lay dying. Only the year before, he had stood triumphantly at the head of the Persian Gulf. Oops. There we go. That's what we want. Here. You all know where the Persian Gulf is. The first Roman general ever to humble the Parthian enemy by driving him from his own capital